I think it has started.
Oh, okay. All right. Great. Thank you. Okay. So it's good that the IT troubleshooting is out of the way. Thank you all again for having me here. It's an honor to be here. And honestly, I did not expect such a long introduction. It's because this is an online webinar, and because this is a behavior biology talk, I think we should pat ourselves on the back for the ease with which we as human beings, a very primarily social species, has very easily transferred our physical interactions into interactions on the virtual space, and that speaks volumes for our adaptive behavior as a human species. So I thought I should just mention this before we really jump into the topic today. Before we begin, I have this small audio-visual testing. And if you can hear me and if you can see the ants picture crawling at the back of your screens, you know that you're seeing the same thing that I am seeing, so that we know that we are on the same page. Anyway,
Yes,
so
we are able to see.
Okay. So getting into the topic of the chemistry of behavior. Now, what in the world does that even mean, the chemistry of behavior? You know, when I was in college in my undergrad days, all the students of science, along with me, were basically divided into several groups. There were groups who wanted to graduate in chemistry, and there were groups that wanted to graduate in zoology or botany or, say, physics. And the guys who studied all the life sciences, the botany, zoology types, they hated chemistry. And the guys who studied chemistry hated zoology and botany. Somehow that dynamic was always present in the college, in my years as a grad student. And today, here we are talking about a title which has two disciplines of science. It has chemistry and it has behavior, which is a very important part of the biological sciences. And well, what in the world does that even really mean when you have the convergence of two disciplines coming together? Does it mean that we are talking about chemicals that alter a receiver's behavior? How is it that chemicals bring about a change in the behavior of whoever is receiving these compounds? It kind of brings to mind some kind of funny scientific experiment where some injection is given to a meek human being, and then that meek human being turns into something else. Okay. Or it also brings into mind some kind of experiment where you are bitten by some radioactive spider and some chemicals enter you and it changes your behavior forever. Sadly, we are not going to be talking about Avengers today. And we are also not going to be talking about some other compounds that some of us must be knowing, that are behavior changing compounds, which can be injected, which can be drunk, which could be smoked, and they can change behavior. And we are also not talking about compounds that exist in the environment that can change our behavior, say, by eating the right kind of food or the wrong kind of food. We're not here to talk about this, but we're here to talk about chemicals that may change the behavior of an animal in the context of animal communication. But before we really go into the details, let's make sure we know what we mean by behavior. All right, behavior is such a simple term, but when we try to define it, it kind of sounds very counterintuitive, in the sense we don't know how you would define it. Would you?
Yes. Sorry, can I interrupt you for some
Yes.
time?
Yes,
Since
please.
you're the host, there are some people who are waiting to get
Oh,
admitted. So sorry if you
okay. What
accept
do I
that.
have to do to let them? In?
We will get a participant screen where you will have to just accept all, admit
Oh,
all.
yeah, I can see those.
I'm so sorry for this.
That's fine. But there are lots and lots of
Just
people.
admit all. Just do admit all.
Oh, yeah. All right.
Done?
Yes, I have done that. Okay. So coming back to the session, as I was saying, what does behavior really mean? What about a bird that's drinking nectar from a flower? Is that behavior? Or what about a wolf that's howling and calling out to its mates? Is that behavior? What about an octopus on the sea floor that's camouflaging itself along with the coral reef around it? Is the act of camouflaging itself behavior? And what about something like a dragonfly which is sitting absolutely still on a blade of grass basking in the sun? Is that dragonfly exhibiting some kind of behavior? Well, actually, the answer to that question is that every one of these examples, all of these examples, are examples of behavior. It's basically everything animals do, whether it's movement or whether it's social interaction or cognition or learning. Behavior is all around us. It's the key way in which animals interact with each other. And the thing is, humans have always observed animals anyway, and we know that animals exhibit different types of behaviors. We've been observing them since we started, since human beings really became human beings, because we can see paintings of animals in cave art. And you don't also have, and today, you don't have to be scientists to know that people look at animals or observe animals. Just people who are in the animal husbandry business, for example, would surely know their animals really well. And they may not be doing a very scientific analysis of what their animals are behaving or how their animals are behaving, but they have a very fairly good idea of the behavioral patterns that these animals show. Even pet owners, if you talk to anybody who has a pet, knows their pet in and out. They know the kind of behaviors that animals exhibit. But the thing about all of these observations that human beings make of animal behavior is that we tend to give them an anthropomorphic attribute. Now, anthropomorphic sounds like a very big term, but it's actually really quite simple. All it means is that we give some kind of human quality to these animals. Remember, all our stories of animals used to be those of a fox, which is very cunning, a very wily fox or a cunning fox. Or the dove in stories is shown to be a very peace loving, innocent dove. Well, although in real life, the fox is neither cunning and nor is the dove very peace loving. It's just not, it's a very human quality that is attributed to animals. And that's a slightly unscientific way of looking at things. But this is how behavior was observed, animal behavior was observed up till the 19th century, except by Charles Darwin, who did not do these kinds of anthropomorphic observations. So all that changed in the early 20th century when comparative psychology started growing as a field, where animals were studied for in a very unbiased, analytical way. All right. And one of the famous examples of comparative psychology is that of Pavlov's dog, where the dog was a bell would be ringing in the background every time the dog was given food, and the dog would start salivating when it looked at food. So it got conditioned to listening to the bell every time it saw food. And then when food was not presented to the dog, but the bell was rung, it again started salivating anyway. So that's a famous example of comparative psychology. But there are many other examples as well, where one of the professors, one of the scientists, Charles Turner, actually discovered that honeybees have color vision. And that he discovered back in the early 1900s, which was quite a feat. So these are the kind of experiments that started happening about 100 years ago in comparative psychology. But the thing about these experiments was that they all happened in the laboratory environment, where there was no, where animals were taken out of their natural habitats and put into a laboratory, and their behavior was studied. So soon another field of behavior was founded in the early to mid 20th century, and that is called ethology, which is the formal study of animal behavior. And von Frisch, Lorenz, and Tinbergen were the three main, the founders of ethology, really, who founded this separate discipline within the field of biology, where behavior studies were conducted. All right. And they have really created the foundations for this discipline. And one of the major contributions that they have done is the Tinbergen's 4 questions. So all the studies that you can possibly have in animal behavior studies, all the questions you can possibly have in animal behavior studies fit into one of these 4 questions. All right. You can either you can either have a question which falls in what is the first 2 squares on top, which are the proximate kind of questions, or you can have the ultimate questions, which are the 2 squares at the bottom. And I will come to this later in the presentation when I explain some examples. So the major thing that happened with this is that with time, as ethology started growing as a discipline, just descriptive kind of behaviors like, okay, this is how big the brood of animals is, and the courtship behavior is so and so, this is the first step and this is the second step in the courtship of so and so animal, etc., is a very descriptive kind of study, and that is a species centric approach. But you can also, I mean, if you remember, around the 1950s, also the genetic studies got a huge impetus, and that is because the double helical structure of DNA was figured out in the 1950s. So it kind of moved on from a species-centric approach to a genetic or gene-centric approach. The animal behavior studies themselves kind of started moving in that direction. Now, I mentioned the double helix structure because the mid 20th century was a time when a lot of interesting things started happening in the scientific world. There was a convergence of various disciplines coming together, and different scientific disciplines started talking to each other across across the stream. So for example, you had Tinbergen, who published his famous book, The Study of Instinct, in 1951, and the DNA double helix structure was discovered. Now, why I talk about convergence is that, remember, the double helix structure was not discovered by a biologist. It took a chemist and a physicist to come together to discover one of the biggest mysteries of biology of that day, which was the double helical structure. So Watson was a chemist and Crick was a physicist, and those guys came together and they were able to find to discover the double helical structure. So it kind
Hello.
of hello.
Yeah, ma'am, sorry to interrupt you. There are quite a few participants who are waiting for entry into the webinar.
Okay, sorry. I'm very sorry again.
Sorry. Thank you so much.
No problem. All right. So where was I? Yeah, so this was a time when a lot of convergence of different disciplines came together. And in 1959, the first pheromone was discovered. Now, we'll come to this in some time as to why this was important. But let me also mention that in 1962, The Silent Spring was published, which is supposed to be the book that started the modern conservation movement. So, which also talked about a lot of chemicals in our environment. So, on the right-hand side, if you can see pictures, what I'm trying to really depict there is that on the one hand, you have landscapes that the human eye can see, but beyond what the human eye can see, our world is totally full of all sorts of chemicals and compounds in the air, in the soil, in the very organisms that are around us. And they are all around us, and this is sort of the convergence of biology and chemistry coming together. So why is this discovery of the first pheromone very important? First of all, what is a pheromone? It's a chemical that is secreted or given out by one organism, and it communicates to another organism, and it has the potential to change the behavior of another organism. But pheromones work within the same species. So pheromone is a chemical used by organisms to communicate between each other, as long as the organisms are of the same species. And by that, what I mean is that basically what's happening is that the chemical is giving off some kind of information from the sender to the receiver. So this was important, and there is a reason why I mentioned this discovery in the mid 20th century, is that when the first pheromone was discovered, they used the behavior patterns of that organism to really discover it. By that, what I mean is the first pheromone that they discovered belongs to a moth called as the domesticated silk moth, which you must be very well aware of, Bombax mori. And at that time, because our our analytical equipment at that time was not as advanced as it is today, Butenant, who was the guy who discovered the pheromone, used 500,000 moths, okay, for getting a sample of 11 milligrams of material. So this is how much effort had to be put in to get just 11 milligrams of material. And there was no way that our equipment or our analytical equipment was able to detect pheromones in such small quantities. And so he didn't use equipment that has been invented by humans. He actually used the male moths to know if the pheromone was present in his samples or not. So if it's a female pheromone, the male moths would react to it, and he would use the reactions, the behavior, the change in behavior of the male moths to know whether his samples have the pheromone present in it or not. And Butenant came from the physiological chemical background, and he used behavior to come to his conclusion. So, pheromones are not the only sort of behavior altering compounds, right? Even hormones do that to some extent. Although hormones have more effects on the physiological sense. But in the long run, it's also hormones that can bring about a behavioral change. So why do we talk about pheromones? It's because that pheromones have a direct effect on the behavior, and because of that, the assays that we use to test if the pheromone is present or not in a given chemical sample, the only way to do that is to do a behavioral assay. Whereas for hormones, you can know them by other physiological assays, that is, assays that can be conducted without using the behavior of an organism to know whether the hormone's present or not, like say radioimmunoassays, to know whether the hormones are present in a given sample or not. I am going to do a small check, and I'm going to show you all a video and tell you what I really mean by this. So give me a second to get that thing sorted, to get the video sorted. Okay, if you can see this, and I hope you can. can see the one on the right hand side is the female and her abdomen is protruding out, whereas the male is the one on the man's finger, and the male is excited. It's beating its wings because the female was letting the pheromones out, and that's when they start mating. So this is what an effect a pheromone can have on the behavior of an organism. It can, because this a certain video was that of a male moth, the same moths that we talked about, these silk moths, and the same pheromone that I just talked about. The female is letting out a pheromone which attracts the males to her, and this is the kind of reaction you would get if the pheromone is really present. And Butenant, Adolf Butenant, who discovered the first pheromone, used this male's behavior to discover it. But that doesn't mean hormones are not having any effect on behavior either. It's just that hormones act within a person's body. So they have an effect on the very individual that produces them, whereas pheromones work on another organism. They don't work on the same organism that is producing the pheromone. All right. And hormones, pheromones, and behavior can all come together to give some kind of an effect. So for example, I'm sorry, I need to admit people again. So for example, take the example of mice. In mice urine, you get traces of both. You have hormones also, and you get pheromones also. Now, the quality of the mouse, okay, the quality of the male is indicated by the hormones that are present. But the thing is, those hormones are non-volatile. They are proteins or peptides, which are heavy molecular weight entities. They can't evaporate into the air, and they cannot travel greater distances to attract another organ, to attract the female. Whereas there are volatiles that are present in the urine that can do this. So, those are the pheromones. They are volatile, such as they are small molecular weight compounds that can pass through the urine of the mouse, and they travel long distances, and they can let the females show where the male mouse is. Also, a lot of animals, what they do when they are ready to mate is that they urinate often, and they also urinate or leave their feces in exposed places so that they can be found and these compounds can be detected, which is a change in the way they behave. So hormones, pheromones, and behavior can often work together. But let's just kind of make sure we get what we mean by these pheromones. Pheromones belong to a larger category of chemicals known as semiochemicals. And these are basically compounds that can alter the behavior of whoever the receiver is. There are more categories of compounds which fall under this group of semiochemicals, and according to their functionality, you can have different categories. So while pheromones are something that are species wide and they can't have an effect within the organism, but in an organism that is a different organism, there are something called as allelochemicals, which work on individuals of different species. All right, so there are different ways in which you can, based on functionality, you can define compounds that are used for transferring information from one organism to another. And what they can do at the end is bring about some kind of behavioral change. So here we are talking about chemicals that can alter a receiver's behavior. We all just saw in the video that how something that was released by the female moth was making the male moth very excited, and it was beating its wings so rapidly. So just the way these chemicals can bring about a change in the receiver's behavior, those chemicals are being released by an organism, right? So when that organism basically is bringing about a change in another organism, or at the end, what you get is the definition for animal communication. So for example, if I go to a music concert and I listen to my favorite musician play my favorite song, it makes me want to sing, all right? Or if I hold hands with my best friend and if I go for a walk with her, it makes me want to say walk faster, or makes me bond with her much better. Or if I see my favorite movie star on screen, I can blush just looking at somebody I really have a crush on, right? Or if I smell food that I really enjoy, that can make me hungry, or that can make me salivate. So at the end, all of these are nothing but modalities of communication. We are getting some kind of cue or signal from the environment, and these are the ways in which organisms communicate with each other. And this is not just true for humans, but it's also obviously true for non-human animals as well. So when a wolf howls, it's communicating with its fellow wolves. Or when primates sit together and groom each other, grooming can lead to a lot of important bonds that form between the two animals. Or for example, if a peacock's feathers, the male peacock with its iridescent feathers is attracting the female with optic cues, and so on. So those are acoustic, tactile, or optic ways in which communication can be transferred, and these are nothing but modalities, or the ways in which the signal can be transferred from one organism to the other. And chemical communication is one of those modalities. But then why are we stressing so much on chemical communication? What's so special about it? Well, basically, chemical communication is the oldest form of communication that exists, and it's also most widespread. It's not hard to imagine that, because when the first cells evolved on our planet, they talked to each other in the sort of primordial soup that they were in, using chemicals. So it's the very first way in which communication really started among bacteria, among fungi, and now also among plants and animals. But understanding its origin has been not so easy for us scientists. And another important thing about that is that there is such a pronounced diversity, in the sense there are so many thousands and thousands of compounds that are used in the animal kingdom for communication, that we just absolutely don't know how that's happening and why is it happening. And as scientists who are trying to understand the origin of this diversity of chemical compounds that is around us, we are still trying to grapple with the kind of mysteries that are presented by chemical communication. So let's take an example of the red harvester ants. I could not get a picture of red harvester ants, so the picture on the left does not really depict the species that I'm talking about. But let's assume for a moment that those are red harvester ants, and those live in a nest, just like we would expect a lot of social insect species to live. And they also have the caste system, which is very quintessential of eusocial species. So they have foragers, they have patrollers, and they also have nest maintenance workers. All right, so the foragers go out and they search for food. Patrollers go out. Before the foragers step outside, the patrollers go and they locate the food. Whereas the nest maintenance workers, they don't go out at all. They are sort of stationed in the nest. Now, on top of the bodies of these ants, there is something called as there are these special chemicals that are present on top of their bodies, and they are called cuticular hydrocarbons because they are basically made of hydrogen and carbon, and they are present on the cuticle. So that's why they are called as cuticle hydrocarbons. Now, the thing about these red harvester ants is that the foragers and patrollers, they have a different kind of mixture of cuticular hydrocarbons, that is compounds present on their bodies, compared to the compounds that are present on the bodies of the nest maintenance workers. So this was this sort of different thing that scientists observed, that imagine the skin of somebody who works out in the sun and or goes outdoors for their work is different from the skin of a person who has a very indoor job, a very desk job, and who doesn't go out in the sun. So just the way our skin patterns or our skins would differ, even the skins of these ants basically differ. And so here's so what I just explained to you is the chemistry part. Now let's check out the behavior part. The behavior part is that, as I said earlier, the patrollers, they go out of the nest first and they check for availability of food. And then after a while, those patrollers come back. They don't take the food with them. They just come back. And once the patrollers are back, the foragers go out and then they go and collect the food. All right. So some kind of information is being transferred between the patrollers and the foragers. And we don't know how they are communicating this information. And we don't even know how does it really affect the behavior of the foragers. So a very interesting experiment was carried out to find the answer to this question. What they did was, they let these bunch of scientists, what they did was, they let a bunch of patrollers go out in the wild from the ant nest, but they didn't let the patrollers come back. They just picked up those ants and they kept them away from the nest. Okay, and they did that for 30 minutes. So the patrollers did not come back. The foragers waited and waited for the patrollers to come back. They didn't come back and the foragers just stood there. They did not go out of the nest. All right. Then what the scientists did was, they took glass beads that were covered with the same kind of compounds that are found on the bodies of the patrollers. Okay. And those glass beads, they introduced into the nest. So once the foragers who are waiting inside the nest, they kind of, with the antennas, the ants kind of come together and they kind of entangle their antennas and, both their antennas sort of come together and start tingling those antennas. So that's what the foragers did. They did that to the glass beads, and they kind of checked out the glass beads with their antennas. And when the glass beads were covered with the same kind of cuticular hydrocarbons, the same kind of material that you get on the skin of the patrollers, the ants went out. The foragers went out. But if the glass bead was covered with the skin type or the cuticular hydrocarbons of the nest maintenance workers or the foragers, they did not step out of the ant nest. That is, that there was something on the body of the patrollers that they were checking out, basically the chemical composition that was there on the body of the patrollers, that the foragers were reading from their bodies, which was letting them communicate whether it's safe to go out there and get the food. All right. So the behavior of the ant, the green ant, which is the forager, is dependent on what information it gets from the chemical compounds it is receiving from the brown ant, which is the patroller. All right. So encounters with other ants thus inform a worker's decision on whether to perform a particular task or not. Okay. And then it's also very interesting to note that those hydrocarbons, those cuticular hydrocarbons that I just spoke about, just the way our skin would be different because we are out in the sun, and somebody who has a desk job and is indoors, their skin is different. It's because what reaction the sun has to our skin, or what the outside environment has with our skin, it's basically the same thing that's happening with those ants too. What happens is that the conditions outside the nest are warm and dry, and that triggers a chemical reaction on top of their bodies, which changes the cuticular chemistry of those ants. So it's something as simple as that, but it conveys information. It makes the foragers do what they have to do. So remember, I spoke about something called as convergence questions, and there were these 4 squares that I spoke. This kind of experiment falls in the first square, which talks about the mechanistic view for finding out what a behavior is doing. All right, it's a question such as, how does so and so behavior take place? So if we were to ask a question that, how is it that the foragers know whether it's safe to go out there, that's the kind of question we would ask to and perform this experiment to get an answer. So that's just a quick example of what chemical communication between animals can bring about. But the larger question is that, how exactly are these compounds bringing about that change, and why? I mean, why in the world are they even bringing about that change? Now, the way to go about this is that there are many theories, but one of the more accepted theories in this is that there are a lot of compounds that animals emit into the environment, and they just do that inadvertently, in the sense that those compounds don't have any kind of communicative meaning or any kind of communicative, they don't have any information as such. All right, but they can be picked up by another organism or other organisms, and information can be derived out of them. So for example, when animals excrete, eliminate waste products, or they have a lot of metabolic byproducts like sweats or waste products, or they have defense products, defense substances that are released by plants, for example, these kinds of substances are excreted or secreted by organisms all the time in the environment. And evolution kind of allows for these chemicals or these compounds to become the carriers of information. So I'll give you an example and show you what I mean. One very famous example is that of formic acid. You may already know this, that a lot of ants have this potential of squirting formic acid on predators who come to predate on their nest. So they spray this acid, which obviously is an irritant for the predators, and make the predators go away. But formic acid, the moment the ants release formic acid, it is used by ants which are in the interior part of the nest. Those ants can detect formic acid and know that, oh, there is something wrong happening and we are under attack. And formic acid then finally gets selected for by evolution to become something called as an alarm pheromone. Okay, so it's a way for the ant to raise an alarm if a predator is starting to raid its nest. And something like formic acid, which was just used to deter a predator by squirting on the predator, is now being used by other ants also, which are in the nest, to use it as an alarm pheromone. And this is how different communication systems can evolve. Another interesting way in which communication systems can evolve is that you must have heard of this very famous example of the giraffes and the acacia trees. So what happens is acacia trees don't want to be eaten up by the giraffes. They don't want this herbivory to happen. And they have physical defenses like the thorns that acacia trees have on them, so that the giraffes can't eat them. But the giraffes have managed, with their very thick tongues, they have evolved very thick tongues that can find their way through the thorns and eat the sort of the acacia leaves. So what the acacia plant has done is that the moment it is getting eaten up on one side of the plant, it starts releasing certain compounds in the air which travel through the air to another side of the plant. And those compounds are volatiles. They can travel in the air. And by the way, that method of communicating from one side of the plant to another side of the plant through the air, and not through the systemic way in which plants would communicate through the xylem and phloem, it's faster if it goes by air. All right, so if it goes by air to the other side of the plant, and those other undamaged parts of the plant are then alerted of this imminent attack. Now, the way systems have evolved is that those volatiles, the same volatiles, can be used by another plant, a neighboring plant in the air, in this vicinity. Those also pick it up, and they are also then informed of imminent attack. Okay, so what basically happens is that this is how communication between organisms starts evolving, or these are the sort of starting points in which communication can start evolving from smaller substances that are used to have some kind of communicative function between one side of the plant to another side of the plant, but then a second plant starts eavesdropping on this communication channel and also starts benefiting from it. A third way in which these substances can have yet another communication channel come in is that there are defensive substances that the plants release when they are under attack, when they get eaten up by say herbivorous animals like giraffes. But when those defensive substances are released in the air, there are pollinators in the air, the plants pollinators in the air, that can detect the same chemical substances and use them to locate the plant. All right, so that pollinator has nothing to do with the giraffe and has nothing to do with the plant being eaten up, but it has again sort of eavesdropped into the communication channel, and it has benefited from it. So these are ways in which communication in the animal kingdom can evolve, and there are a lot of many other ways, but I think we are running out of time. So I'm just going to do my final slide where I can very quickly mention that there are these communication channels don't necessarily have to involve only one modality, but you can have chemical, you can have tactile together, you can have combinations of different communication channels coming together. And that's called the multimodality in communication, through which animals also communicate. So that's the end of my talk, because I don't think I have much time left. And thank you so much for letting me talk here. And these are some further reading.
Okay. So, thank you for this talk, Dr. Yashada. Now, we would go and we will start with our question answer session. We'll take a few questions to start with. The first question is, how can volatiles help alert the plants itself and others of attack? In the sense, how can plants potentially defend themselves on receiving an alert?
Oh, so once they receive the chemical compound, which is telling them that that there is an attack coming up, they produce something called as tannins. So acacias generally do produce tannins, which are distasteful. So the leaves don't taste as good as they normally would, and it would deter the giraffe from eating them.
Okay.
I guess that is what the question was. I mean, is that
Yeah.
what? Yeah.
Yes. So the next question is from Sneha Narayanan. When an organism marking its territory, does it secrete any chemical? If yes, then is it allelochemical so that other species stay away from it? But then if the chemical is secreted from two animals of the same species, how is one type of chemical distinguished from the other?
Oh, that's such a lovely question. Okay, so when organisms secrete chemicals in their urine, and when they are marking their territories, yes, that is one of the important behavioral aspects that we can see in animals conveying information. So when you see animals marking their territories, there's a huge communication channel that they're opening up. They're sending out all sorts of information. So they're sending out things like, first of all, this territory belongs to me. But the second thing an animal could be sending, if it's a female, she's trying to tell males in the vicinity that she's in estrus. She could be doing that by hormones that are present in the urine. And there are pheromones that those are trail pheromones or marking pheromones, as they are called. They get released in the air, and they travel longer distances, and they attract males towards her. So this is how and what is the second part that she asked? That was also interesting. She was asking something about interspecies communication.
Just a sec. If the chemical is secreted from two animals of same species, how is one type of chemical distinguished from the other?
If the chemical is
secreted from two animals of same species, how is one type of
chemical? Okay, I got it. So this is also so the second part is also quite I'm so delighted that you asked me this question. So pheromones, as I said, are they are unique to, they are species wide signals, but then along with pheromones you have something called as signature mixtures. I am on that screen, and if you can see me, beside the pheromones, there is this left-hand box here, which is called a signature mixture. So that mixture is unique to that animal. Or it can be unique to, suppose if you're in an ant nest, one ant nest, there could be a chemical mixture, a signature mixture on the ants of that nest, which is unique to that ant nest. Or if an individual will have its unique, like for example, in humans especially, you can distinguish smells of individuals, in the sense, I know my mother's smell. I'm very uh, uh, I can't define that smell, but I know that my mother's smell is very different from anybody else, so I'm able to define it. So that's a signature mixture, and those come in useful to identify individuals when animals are communicating.
We take the next question, which is from Ms. Aditi Gupta. By affecting the pheromones and interaction between two animals, would we actively impact evolution?
By affecting what?
By affecting the pheromones and interaction between two animals, would we actively impact evolution?
If it goes on for a long time, maybe. So for example, you would definitely, I'm not sure about evolution because it's such a long-term effect, but you would definitely have a localized effect. If carried on for a long enough time, it could have it. For example, I'll give you an example of here in Australia, where there is some work going on in the in invasive species problems that we have in Australia, where there's an invasive toad species called the cane toad, and they're trying to change the way the toads communicate with each other to make sure that their population is reduced. So you could, if used the right way, you could change evolutionary trajectories in a certain space. Yeah. But
so
it comes with a lot of ifs and buts.
Okay, there are still many more questions, but we are really short of time and we cannot take each and everything. But the participants, I think, can ask or can mail the speaker if she would like to, and get the questions solved later on.
Yeah.
Okay, so right now we have to conclude the session. I'm so sorry, participants, I cannot take all of your questions. We will move on to the vote of thanks. I would like to thank. I would like to take the opportunity to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of Zoology Department of Ramnarain Ruia Autonomous College. First of all, I would like to thank our principal, Dr. Anushri Lokur, Madam, our vice principals of Senior College, all the deans and our management for giving us this opportunity to conduct this webinar. I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Yashada Kulkarni. It was indeed an illuminating session where we got a wonderful insight of animal communication, and that also via chemical communication, which is really very rare, which we don't study about. I thank you for taking out your valuable time for this webinar. I would also like to thank Ms. Ujali Shirodkar for lending us her beautiful artwork of ants communication, which you can see on the poster. It really helped to make our poster more attractive and more meaningful. I would like to thank our entire department of zoology, our HOD, Dr. Jesse Pius Madam, Dr. Vaishali Pusate Ma'am, Dr. Durga Patkar Ma'am, Dr. Swati Deshmukh, Dr. Shakir Momin, and Ms. Anjali Mari for their unwavering support. I earnestly thank Mr. Abhijit Gore from Computer Science Department for his guidance and technical support for the conduct of the webinar. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all the participants for their wholehearted support, without which this would not have been such a successful event. Once again, thank you all. Before we leave, a small request to all the participants. I request you all to fill the feedback form, which we are going to send you on your registered email ID. We would like to have your opinion about the same, which would help us further. So thank you. With this, we conclude our session. Stay home and stay safe. Thank you all.
Thank you.